Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean, a Catholic PhD student in philosophy at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto.
I'm Matt. I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois. My research interests are media archaeology and cultural theory. But before we get started, we wanted to introduce a new Magnificast feature, voicemail.
Between voicemail and the email newsletter that we just started, we're going back in time actually in the podcast.
That's right. The new feature is pigeons. Well, we made a Google Voice number where you can call us and leave us a message. The number is... Okay, I'll wait for you to write this down because I know you're going to. The number is 815-408-0745. So you can give us a call and tell us something cool about your church, your party, your cadre, your revolutionary group fighting against the government is doing, and you can tell us about it, and we'll play it on the podcast. You can, give us a question that you might have. You can tell us about something we got totally wrong in the last episode. God knows there are probably things. You can ask us. Yeah, he knows. I'm sorry, or she knows. God knows. I don't know. The gender thing. It's important. You can ask us like general life advice. We'll be bad at answering that, but you could do it. So
you can also give us general life advice.
Oh yeah,
we need a lot of that.
That'd be good. I have a lot of questions about taxes, just and about doing them. So you can call us. You can tell us your name, or you can be anonymous. I don't. Whatever you want. Fake names are fun, so come up with a good one. Well,
if you do it anonymously, though, you have to have a Guy Fawkes mask on.
That's true. The entire time, we'll know. So if you call in, there's a pretty good chance you'll hear your voice on the next episode of the Magnificast. That's neat. How cool. We're very cool people. Oh my gosh, invest in this. So the number again is 815-408-0745. We'll see how this goes. You could be on the podcast.
You can tell by the desperation in Matt's voice that we're really hoping that this goes well. So please send us your hot takes.
We took tens of minutes to set this up, so please participate. Oh my gosh.
So this week on the Magnificast, we're talking with Matt Sitman, an editor at Commonweal, who recently wrote an article for Dissent magazine called Against Moral Austerity on the Need for a Christian Left. So in the episode, we talk about morality and politics, as you might suspect, liberalism and the left, public and private reason, what it means to build coalitions and how super hard and annoying it is. We talk about private property and more. So thanks again, Matt, for stopping by, and hope you like the podcast. Hey, so Matt Sitman, that's what we're going to call you on this podcast, Matt S. Thanks for coming on the podcast. It's really cool. It's been, fun to chat with you on the internet, but it's more fun now, I think, to, get a chance to ask you some real life questions and see your face and all that sort of thing, in virtual real life, I guess. So usually on the podcast, we just start off asking, what's up? What have you been up to? What's your day job? What do you like to do? Think of this as your Christian leftist dating profile, I guess.
Well, the short version is I'm an associate editor at Commonweal magazine, which is I believe this fall will be 93 years old, a 93-year-old kind of liberal Catholic magazine. And that's my day job, and it takes up a lot of my time. But I live here in New York, and I write essays for other places. This is the essay we'll talk about today is the second kind of fairly major essay I've written for Dissent. And that's a magazine I'm really proud to be associated with. And otherwise, it's, New York's great. And I'm really happy here. I never aspired to live or move to New York City, but I came here a few years ago I was the literary editor of a publication called The Dish, Andrew Sullivan's old blog and website. And that's what brought me to New York. And then when The Dish closed up shop, after about 15 years of Andrew blogging and killing himself. Living online for that long, we decided to end the dish, and shortly thereafter I started a Commonweal. So that's my life in New York.
Cool. That sounds like a neat like millennial HBO story. I feel like you could probably
Yeah, and I have a little bit of an academic background. I'm a failed academic, you might say. I was a PhD student at Georgetown for a while, and I was a political theorist by training.
Cool.
So my kind of academic background is in political theory, and I did a lot of work on the Reformation and Calvin's political thought, and I was interested in sort of Calvin and early modern thought, Hobbes, Rousseau, and Calvin and Hobbes, and actually that was a sort of pretty big factor in my eventually becoming Catholic. So I'm not a convert. I was received into the church. I was a Christian already. I was Episcopalian. But sort of reading so much about the Reformation it factored into my becoming Catholic. Spending that much time in Calvin's institutes pushed me.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah.
That's funny because I'm a Catholic PhD student at a Calvinist school. So
oh, really?
I get it.
I didn't realize.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It is and it isn't. It very is Calvinist. It's the Institute for Christian Studies, and it is associated with the Christian Reformed Church, which is a Dutch Calvinist group. But yeah, me and another Catholic are the only two PhD students accepted the year that I was here. So they're very I don't know, friendly.
Good.
Matt B, what have you been up to?
Been working on this paper proposal for the entire morning and most of the afternoon, trying to get it right. Just doing this paper on media history and imaginary media history, which is like a weird thing, but it's real. Look it up. I don't know. Trying to get my 250 word proposal just right. Not doing it. Failing terribly at it. That's all I've been doing today. Writing the same thing over and over again, trying to figure out like what I'm doing wrong. Pretty frustrated. Good time to talk to me.
Yeah, 250 words is like a very weird box to force, a potentially 25-minute paper into.
Yeah, totally. I remember those days of the abstracts and the conference proposals, and yeah. Yeah, I don't really miss it, I have to say. I like being a magazine editor more than I ever liked being in academia.
Yeah, I hate writing proposals, but I love going to conferences, especially if they're in nice places. So that's what I'm in it for.
Actually, my one visit to Toronto was they had the American Political Science Association conference there, like I don't know, circa 2010. That was
nice.
my one visit to Toronto. But I liked the city. I was impressed by it. I was jumping off your going to nice places for conferences. I actually was impressed.
Yeah, Toronto's awesome. I went there last year for a conference too, and the conference was whatever, but I hung out with Dean, so it was cool, and we did stuff in the city.
Yeah, it is.
It was a good time.
Yeah, I feel like it's also just conferences are the best place to meet people doing weird stuff that you wouldn't have thought about. So I appreciate that, but yeah, I don't know, the grind of just desperately pitching papers. I don't know, it's rough. Yeah.
Though that conference in Toronto we were at, Dean, that one guy, I tried to introduce myself to this guy who was from St. Louis, which is near where I live, so I was going to be nice and like a outgoing person. And I introduced myself to him, and then he asked me if I could help him fix his computer at that time, and I was very upset. I was like, "Why would you ask me that?"
Because you're young and wear glasses.
Yeah, that's right. So I was like, "No, see you later." It was bad. Dean, what have you been doing, man?
Yeah, not too much. Writing some articles. I'm a journalist at America Magazine. Also, Matt B and I started a newsletter for the podcast, so I spent a lot of the week figuring that out and playing with it, and that was really fun. I have a weird I don't know, I get a lot of pleasure from editing software online. I don't know why. I should have been a design layout person or something, maybe in a former life or a future life. But yeah, that's been good. Also this morning I went to the Royal Ontario Museum with my partner Emily's a nanny. She nannies 2 kids. They're 7 and 4-ish. And then with a friend that I knew on the internet, James McCormick, who also has 2 kids, 4 and like 2-ish, I guess. So that was really fun, like romping through natural history with a bunch of little kids who were like very into dinosaurs. Yeah, it's a good way to spend an afternoon. So that was nice.
Nice.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah. And I should add, tonight is actually the Dissent launch party for the issue. So,
Oh, cool.
it's short, not long after we're done recording this, I'll head to Brooklyn, naturally.
Yeah.
Yes.
And hang out with the Dissent folks.
Awesome. Well, you can tell them all about this episode, and hopefully you can say that we were nice to you and it was a good experience. So we'll find out.
Yeah, well, it remains to be seen. We'll see.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, on that note, let's go ahead and get into it. Let's see how it goes. Matt S., maybe you could just start by giving a little bit of a summary of the article that you wrote for people who haven't read it. So for those that don't know, this is an article that appeared in Dissent recently. It's called Against Moral Austerity, How Religion Can Revitalize the Left. Yeah, so all those words are interesting to us. Could you maybe just give a little pitch?
Yeah, sure. It might be helpful to give a little bit of the background to the essay, where it came from. So the editor of Dissent, Michael Kazin, was one of my teachers in grad school. So I've known Kazin for over a decade now. And, he just sent me a note and he said, so are you thinking about anything about religion in light of Trump's victory and kind of the debates on the left? And so I said, yeah, this is, I am thinking about it. And what I came up with was the essay that just dropped in Dissent. It's in the summer issue. And the basic argument, I suppose, is that let me take a step back. Oftentimes, I think, when Democrats lose, or, there's always a refrain that they need to understand religion better. The statistics will get trotted out that, a certain percentage of evangelicals voted for the Republican candidate, or a certain number of Roman Catholics voted for the Republican candidate. And, this is a narrative that's been, the first time I really, really remember hearing it was when John Kerry lost in 2004. I mean, I was pretty young. I was, maybe 21, 22 during that election. But I remember the God gap was like one of the major narratives that came out of that. And so this essay is but oftentimes that means that people say, well, Democrats need to get religion, and that mainly means moderating their stances on social issues. That's what getting religion means. And the argument I wanted to make here was actually, first of all, in terms of the debates on the broad liberal left, it's actually the left that is better suited to kind of align with or work together with religious people, or that should be the case, based on what I think is a shared understanding of what human beings deserve by virtue of being human. And that especially matters, I think, economically, in terms of healthcare, sort of what we provide people, what we think people deserve. That concept of desert is what I thought was the main shared value between religious folks, or what religious folks should believe, and the left. And the essay is, I would get at that toward the end of the essay, but I really start the essay by trying to, I wrote this for Dissent. I didn't write it for Commonweal, so I was writing for a largely secular audience, I think. And so a fair amount of the essay is me kind of making the case that this isn't bad or dangerous to engage with religion in this way. And then as I go on, as I said, I kind of spell out toward the end sort of a broad framework for what I think those shared values are between religious people and the left, after I make the case that religion's not scary or dangerous. Too scary or too dangerous.
Yeah, cool. So there's a lot of really interesting points in this essay. I think Dean and I have some good notes to work from here. But before we even get to like the actual text, I was wondering if we could talk about the subtitle for just a minute, like a clarifying point, I guess. This is about how religion can revitalize the left, and I wonder, like, this is like a stupid question, but I think one worth asking still. Like, what is the left in this sense? Like, is it everyone that's a Democrat and not a Republican? Is it people who are not Democrats or Republicans? Like, how do we conceptualize that?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, I play a little bit fast and loose with terms like mainstream liberalism, the left, the broad liberal left. And these terms are contested and a bit amorphous. But in this case, I mean people who are not just Democrats or not just broadly left of center, but the left in terms of probably being some kind of social democrat, um, the left in terms of probably at least having some kind of critical relationship toward mainstream liberalism. Um, and so, I mean, yeah, the left as in a certain distinction to liberalism, uh, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
If I'm
does.
still being too vague, I can say more. But in that I'm not. I'm both trying to not be too particular in my use of the term, and I'm but I do think it's still a meaningful term in it, and I'm using it in the sense I described.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I guess too, like by virtue of writing for Dissent, you can kind of count on your audience to hopefully have some good like points of reference. And that's great. I wonder, could you say a little bit more about how leftism differs from liberalism? Because that's like a big thing that's slowly emerging in popular articles. I think in a helpful way. And the trouble is, a lot of liberals, in particular, are reading those challenges and thinking, well, hey, I'm the left because I'm not, on the right, if the right means Republicans or whatever. And then it's kind of the leftist's job in a way, or the burden is on them to kind of say, well, we mean something different and here's what that is. So yeah, just to maybe build a little bit more on what you were just saying, could you give like a short, this is what I mean by the left in distinction to, say, liberalism?
Yeah, sure. No, you're right. I mean, and this is a kind of odd American debate because we use liberal in a way that's different than I think like Europeans would use the term. So in America, liberal means, yeah, kind of like broadly, almost generically left of center. But really, it's a philosophical or it's a tradition of political philosophy that goes back, I don't know, to Hobbes, Locke, the beginning of the early modern period. And I think, it's if I were to identify a few key points in it, it's individualistic for one. I mean, the liberal tradition begins with sort of positing individuals in the state of nature who contract together to form governments and societies. So, just at the level of a kind of philosophical anthropology, I'm not a liberal in that sense, a kind of individualist.
Check mark.
Right, right. But also the way I use the term liberal in the piece is it's how should I put it? Especially with regard to religion, I describe liberalism as the organization of separations, and that's a term I borrow from the French political philosopher Pierre Manon. And it's kind of what one thing liberalism does is try to really narrow the scope of politics, and it often, or at least I make the case in the essay, it can mean that what you think politics is incredibly narrow, and there's not a lot of space for moral critiques of what's going on, and there's a sense in which that term, the organization of separation, it can mean the separation of powers, the separation of church and state, but also the separation of sort of the economy from political control or democratic control. So, again, liberalism is a contested term, but I mean it in the sense I've described. And well, I guess I've been rambling. You can interject or ask me further questions, or.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll circle back to some of the stuff kind of later on in the conversation, but I figured, I think you were right, Matt B, to kind of get that out on the table anyway, for folks who are, I guess, uninitiated. So one thing that Matt and I have been talking about, Matt B and I have been talking about sort of as we've been preparing to chat with you, is about the relationship between politics and morality, right? Which you're really kind of making a case that we shouldn't be too afraid of morals in political language, even though there might be good reasons historically that people have felt that way or whatever. You're saying, hey, listen, don't don't let that scare you off from being friendly toward folks who want to use moral language or find it useful. And you give some powerful examples to why that is. I guess one other like clarifying question we could start off with the beginning, and then we'll move on to like actual things you really wrote. Is what do you think that relationship is between politics and morality, which you articulate throughout this whole essay? If you had to make a pitch to people in dissent, as you did here, if you had to like summarize it, why are morals important in a political vision for the left?
Well, I think politics is inescapably moral, and liberalism itself. I do get a little annoyed, even with myself, when I say liberalism says or does or means X, Y, or Z. Right? It's a broad and a broad tradition with many mansions in it, or mansion with many rooms, whatever the phrase would be. So I don't want to be too reductive or
many mansions is actually a very good metaphor.
Right? Yeah. Right. So I think politics is inescapably moral, and when you say that you don't think that morals should, a sort of morals-based politics is good, or you're critical of that, I mean, you're still positing that's a moral claim in itself. So I just don't think you can ever really escape moral claims in politics. And even if you think that what I've sketched out is dangerous or unwise, that is itself a moral claim. And one of the things that I think liberalism kind of masks is that it uses the language of neutrality to say, like there's actually this neutral kind of common ground that we can all tap into, or there's a kind of common sort of public reason we can all use to debate these things. And I don't know, I'm skeptical of that claim.
Yeah, me too. I guess another thing that Dean and I were talking about in terms of morality too was that I think kind of like what you said though, that politics is inescapably moral. I guess what it comes down to is like whose morality, and I guess how that gets shaked out. Because I don't know, I guess that's a confusing part to me about the title of your essay too, that there's a moral austerity, because it seems like there's a specific type of moral austerity though, with like another type of morality kind of in there, like there's a liberal morality about right. Centrality or centralism that's kind of ingrained in the Democratic Party, it seems.
Yeah, no, that's true, and if you and that's a fair critique of the title. And I sort of fell in love with the term moral austerity. I thought, it was kind of clever and got at something, and it does pair well with, because we do know the term austerity from talking about economic policies, especially in the wake of the financial crash of 2008. So I was playing off that a little bit. But right, if the critique of my use of moral austerity is that actually liberalism is a form of, posits its own morality, or it posits a certain morality under the guise of neutrality or public reason or whatever, that's fair enough.
I don't think of it as necessarily like a critique of your title. I don't know. I guess it is a little bit, because it's just like it's morality in a different register a little bit, because there's like the one of my favorite parts of this essay, and I guess I'm getting ahead of myself, but where you start talking about Tim Kaine and like his inability to describe about how his like Catholicism affects his religion. It's like that type of moral austerity where it's like you're not willing to let like the rich tradition of Catholicism and all of its good and badness like affect the way you make political decisions. That seems very ridiculous. That is austere in that way. So
yeah, so that's why I kind of gave those examples. The other one was when Bernie went to the Vatican on the eve of the New York primary.
Oh yeah.
I mean, and like, listen, like that can be criticized. Maybe it was a fairly obvious ploy to get Catholic voters in New York. Like maybe he shouldn't have left the campaign trail. I mean, there's all kinds of criticisms you can make, but I thought it was really striking that one of them was he violated the separation of church and state by just going to the Vatican.
Right.
And giving a paper on, like labor and capital, and kind of appealing to the church's long tradition of, about a century long tradition of Catholic social teaching, regarding the economy, and it's just that blew my mind that was the criticism made, that it possibly violated the separation of churches. And it's like wait till you find out we have an ambassador to the Vatican.
And vice versa.
Yeah. It's
a very dumb thing. That's such a dumb take.
Yeah, I was just stunned by it. I was really stunned by it. And again, you can even be really critical of the Catholic Church and various teachings of the Catholic Church, but that doesn't, being critical of the Catholic Church is not the same as saying an old Jewish socialist giving a paper there is violating the separation of church and state. That was the other thing. It was Bernie, right? This is like, he's obviously not endorsing the Catholic Church in some way that would be problematic at all for the separation of church. And this is liberal. That kind of juridical approach to religion is what, does it fall on one side of a line or not? Does it be, I'm not sure if I can't remember if I used the word juridical in the piece or not, but like viewing it as like a legal problem of whether it violates some principle of the Constitution rather than viewing it politically. So I do, the other thing in there is like liberalism is kind of an anti-political politics. And I think that those examples I gave were two that they just stuck in my mind for months. The post in Rolling Stone, that had like just grated on me for months.
The Bernie example is so fascinating because in a way, like Bernie himself made a lot of moral appeals in his own campaign, right? And that's what seemed to register so well. Anytime you talk about, you opened up talking about this a little bit, desserts, right? Like rich people and poor people, those are, anytime you invoke that distinction, you're starting to invoke questions of who gets what and why and who should, etc. And those are they are political questions, they're economic questions, they're judicial questions even, but they're fundamentally moral questions when you start asking what kind of responsibilities do we have to people who fall on the wrong side of capital or something. And it's funny, one thing I thought about as I was reading your article here is that it's almost like that kind of moral way of doing politics is exactly what scandalized the Democratic Party so massively.
Mm-hmm. Totally. And that's, my essay was not a semi-secret Catholic endorsement of Bernie, but because he's an imperfect politician, and but it did seem to me that one source of his appeal was just talking to people in relatively straightforward moral language about what was good, what was bad, what corruption was, what was just, and that resonated with people. And it's shocking that just doing something that basic distinguished him from the pack in the Democratic Party, but it really did. And you can see that in the Clinton campaign that, she would tick off a 5-point plan, but wouldn't just say, I think people deserve X, Y, or Z. Or at least that's, maybe she did sometimes. I'm not trying to be too critical or rehash the primaries, but I did think that the way debates within the Democratic Party played out kind of were lurking in the back of my mind as I wrote this essay too, that what Bernie did was just appeal to people at a fairly straightforward moral level about how we should live together.
Yeah, weird how that appeals to people though.
Yeah. Turns out they like when people tell you to be good sometimes. It's funny because I remember talking to a lot of family. I come from rural Michigan, and basically my whole town voted for Donald Trump.
And the weird thing is in the primaries they did go Sanders in the blue, and then Trump in the red, and then when it came down to it, they obviously voted for Donald Trump. But when I talk to people when I go home, so many of them, I asked them the question: if Bernie Sanders had been running, would you have voted for him?
And a lot of them, they don't say yes, but they don't say no. And that's exactly how they feel. It's like, wow, it would have been a really tough decision if that's what it came down to. And it's like, but why? I mean, it's absurd. It's clearly not a tough decision. It's a very easy decision. But actually, what's being played out there, I think, is this assumption that morality is a part of it. And even though Trump is clearly not a moralistic figure by any stretch, there's this language of authenticity that happens with him. that many voters cite, which is clearly misinformed. But that's the affect that's getting mobilized there, it seems to me. And then it's the same with Bernie, except that he's actually willing to try to sort of speak a certain language and try to live a certain kind of political life, I guess.
Yeah, no, totally. My own experiences inform this essay, and I think they map onto what you described pretty well. I mean, where I grew up in central Pennsylvania, the county where I grew up went 72% for Trump. And during the primaries, Bernie also won my county in the Democratic primaries, the same county that went for Trump so overwhelmingly in the general. And I'll just put it this way: most of my family members voted for Trump, I think, or at least a number of them did. And without getting too specific, well, I guess I mentioned this in an essay that the last essay I wrote for Dissent last summer on growing up in a certain blue collar conservative place and culture. And like my mom, she's a Republican largely because she's pro-life. But when Bernie said, "Oh, you shouldn't go bankrupt if you get cancer," that resonated with her because her 81-year-old mother's in hospice care right now with Alzheimer's. So she knows that medical bills can destroy a family. She's writing checks with my grandfather to, cover some of the costs of this. And she knows how much, Medicare is helping my grandmother. All these things she's aware of them. And when a politician just said, it's wrong for you to go bankrupt if you get sick, like something simple as that really resonated with her because she's just an ordinary person who has to deal with these things day in and day out, like we all do, and that made sense to her. A technocratic 10-point plan on what doing this or that to the Affordable Care Act does not appeal to her in the same way,
right?
As just a straightforward moral appeal.
I mean, we see the same kind of thing playing out in with the whole Jeremy Corbyn situation, like with the Labor Manifesto. People are just like they're mobilized by that, that they would have healthcare, that they have access to education and stuff like that. Those things are important to people, and it seems very simple to understand why, but it seems very hard for the Democratic Party to get on board with that. I know, it's baffling. Yeah. I can't make any sense of that. Yeah.
But no, Corbyn's another great example. And the thing he and Bernie both do is, again, it's like jargon-free, straightforward, moral language about what people deserve by virtue of just being a human being who, is a citizen of the same country as you.
Yeah, right.
Basically, you're my fellow citizen. I think this is what you deserve. And it's not a complicated or technocratic or extremely technical argument. It's just putting it out there in straightforward terms about what people deserve.
Yeah. Well, maybe this is a good time to get into the article a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah.
So starting in probably the worst possible order from almost the last page. On page 112 of the article, you have a really good line that I thought was pretty good. I will definitely tell it to my students next year when I see them. Okay, so you say that being religious doesn't mean your politics have already been decided for you. Religion can infuse political debate with a moral urgency that opens up possibilities for political action rather than shutting them down. So that's cool because, at least in my experience, I teach in a small Christian college in Southern Illinois. And a lot of my students naively think, and a lot of my colleagues too naively think that their religion does have their politics figured out already and just kind of packages it up and gives it to them. But that's not the case, as you say. But I wonder what you would say the religious can contribute to the political. What is it that you think the religious gives the political, morally?
Okay, well, it's interesting that particular line is in the very brief paragraph where I mention abortion. And that was a very complicated, how to handle abortion was a particularly complicated feature of this essay. Because obviously I think had I just said to the left, to the secular left, basically now during the Trump administration, I'm not going to turn to my feminist friends and be like, oh, now's the time for you to get on board with the Catholic church's teaching on abortion, right?
That's savvy of you. So good for you.
But on the other hand, so I wasn't going to do that, and I also just didn't think I would change anyone's mind on that particular issue, and I didn't want to write about it at length. But it seems like when you really get into particulars, like, well, the way that particular issue gets played out, it could play out any number of ways, and I feel like, if someone like Bernie had won the Democratic nomination, he would have been straightforwardly pro-choice, of course. But I also think that if you're a conscientious religious person, it should really have been a struggle for you to figure out, well, how much does it matter to me that he's also advocating for universal healthcare coverage? And, I basically wanted to say in that paragraph that single issue politics is wrong and counterproductive, and simply being religious and even being pro-life does not mean that the abortion issue has to play out for you in one narrow way. And so that line about religion opening up possibilities, that was the context for it. And I think it is true that just because you're religious, and even if you're religious and pro-life or anti-abortion, how that practically plays out isn't always determined ahead of time simply by virtue of being religious and pro-life. Does that make sense, to put it that way? That was the background to that.
It does. And I think I appreciate, too, throughout this article, there are a couple places where you suggest, this is whatever the church teaches and most Catholics seem to think. But, there are Catholics that don't think that. And it's too simple to kind of narrow things down to, whatever the Vatican is saying is how every single Catholic you meet at a, socialist meeting is going to feel about this or that issue. It's interesting, too, because as we were talking about earlier, it's not as though being pro-choice is an immoral or amoral decision per se, right? It's another kind of set of morality. And what's interesting about religion is that it tries to, as you say in this quote that we just read, open up certain possibilities for political action with certain vocabularies that don't necessarily appeal to average folks elsewhere. And, there are ways in which the left can really find, hopefully, those vocabularies amenable to their causes. And those particular issues shouldn't stand in the way of starting a conversation with Catholic hardline person on this or that issue, especially because, there's nothing that says if you're Catholic, you definitely always will think this, or every Catholic that you meet will always think this forever, etc. And that's the nature of doing politics together, is it's not pre-programmed.
Right, exactly. And, even Pope Benedict XVI, back when he was Joseph Ratzinger, wrote this letter to, I forget some of the precise details, but he said, you do not have to be a single issue voter on this. There are proportionate reasons to vote for candidates who back abortion rights, and that it's a complicated moral decision sometimes when you're faced with someone like Trump, who, paid lip service to the pro-life cause and nominated Gorsuch to the Supreme Court, and, kind of is willing to give the Christian right pretty much whatever they want on this. Just because he does that doesn't mean you have to vote for him, because there's many, many other reasons why it'd be terrible, even on pro-life terms, to support this guy, right? So it's a complicated decision, and that was all I really wanted to say in the essay about abortion, was that it doesn't, if that is the only thing that, or if that's a main source of enmity between religious lefties and the secular left, I think that's a shame, because there's a lot we should agree on, and also, again, it just how that plays out in practical terms can be tricky.
Yeah. Also, if we could move to an example that's maybe a little less contentious and makes your point really well.
Yeah. Well, good. I'm glad we can move on from the three white dudes talking about abortion section.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's a weird segue into what I'm about to say, but that's okay.
Because I'm going to bring up your example of Martin Luther King Jr., who uses religious language. You say in here he has a dream, right? That dream language is situated in a particular religious tradition and community. It makes certain moral suggestions. It's tapping into vocabularies that are familiar with, moral conscience and what that means and what that would motivate you to do. And there are plenty of people in the Black radical tradition that I think rightly have criticized King's appeal to the morality of, white oppressors and white supremacy. Assad Shakur being like the most famous one that, appealing to morals doesn't change history per se. But that being said, I mean, undeniably, obviously, Martin Luther King Jr. Made significant gains, political gains, by virtue of using that moral vocabulary. And it's not just moral, it's also religious. And those two things come together in an interesting way there. Not in a way that forestalls, collaborating with people who aren't religious, but hopefully in a way that invites those kinds of collaborations precisely by virtue of being religious or whatever.
Yeah, totally. And, that the King example too, the Dr. King example was one of my old teachers, Jean Beth Geilstein. That was her line I stole. I mean, I gave her credit in the essay, but, that King didn't say, I have a preference, right? He said, I have a dream. And that line, I mean, she used to say that all the time, and it always stuck with me because I just thought it identified something very basic but also true, that the language of preferences it's just not powerful, right? It doesn't move people. It doesn't give people hope. It doesn't stir them. It doesn't, keep them fighting for a cause to speak the language of kind of neutered, technocratic, economistic language.
Yeah. I have a 10-point plan. No, it doesn't work.
Right. Yeah. So that's that was Jean's. Jean's she passed away, I think, in 2013. But that was a line of hers that she used all the time in grad seminars and when she would talk in public about religion and politics, and I always liked it, so I stuck it in the essay.
Yeah, and, of course, it doesn't have to be just MLK. It can be Malcolm X, who, of course, is famously motivated by his religion and his morals politically. We had an episode a long time ago with a guy named Vincent Lloyd at Villanova who was talking about the Black Panthers and their connections to religion. Huey P. Newton was the son of a preacher, and that left a certain stamp on how he comported himself, I think. So, it's complex. Religion is a game of affects, I think, and morality is too, in a lot of ways. And I really like that part of the essay, especially.
I mean, I would even kind of want to underscore that part of the essay more than even the final version of the essay did, and that I originally had a quote from Christian Wyman's memoir, My Bright Abyss. Do you guys know Christian Wyman? Teaches at Yale Divinity. He's a poet, and he's playing with I think George Lindbeck's book on post-liberal Christianity. But the basic point is, he said, you can never be sort of religious in the abstract, right? You're like, there's a certain sense in which the depth of your religion is tied always to a particular tradition, and to go deeper into that tradition is to kind of go deeper into particularity, and that the kind of dream, the liberal dream of kind of neutral, universal public reason actually kind of cuts directly against that deep engagement with a tradition that actually gives you kind of like moral depth and nuance and complexity. And that was one of the points I was trying to make there, that any moralistic politics will always draw on particularistic traditions, because that's what like any real religion is a particularistic tradition.
Right. This whole conversation, like in the background of my head, I've been thinking about this like one weird essay from Kant that I read once. I'm not like I've read like 2 things by Kant, Immanuel Kant, in my entire life, and this is like one of them. And it's this essay he wrote about like about private and public reason, and about like when to use either of them. Mm-hmm. And it's like this really absurd way of being a person in the world. Mm-hmm. So the example that sticks out to me so much is like Kant is like explaining like this military person where he's like this military person has these like reasons to object, I guess, to military service or something like that that kind of stem from his private reason. And Kant's like, yeah, that's fine, he can have those, but he shouldn't ever let them bleed into his like his life of public service. And that same like Kantian logic of like keeping those things super separate is exactly what I see expressed in like I guess center liberalism.
Yeah, totally. And this is, and a lot of that discussion led into the example of, like, the Tim Kaine example was one that really, where I illustrates this well in the sense of, so I make the point that there's no kind of like neutral, universal moral language really, that a moralizing politics will draw on particular traditions in a certain kind of way, but also that we shouldn't view that as the end of the story, that you sort of make public arguments and you kind of just be honest about where you're coming from and what your commitments are, and other people do the same and you try to figure it out, right? Like even Tim Kaine's example of the death penalty, where he said, I didn't feel comfortable doing X, Y, or Z as governor of Virginia because I didn't want to impose my faith on, the rest of the citizenry of Virginia. It's like, well, how much, it almost makes it seem like faith in that sense is this absurdist like leap into, it's just totally like totally beyond reason.
Yeah.
And actually no, like your moral commitments and your religious commitments interact with sort of facts on the ground in a certain kind of way. Like we know certain things about the death penalty, right? That it's inequitably applied, and that African Americans are sentenced to that proportionally far more than white citizens, and that if you make a mistake, it's irrevocable. And there's all these reasons against the death penalty that don't have anything to do with religious faith per se. And actually, the Catholic Church does not demand you be 100% against the death penalty all the time, right? So obviously reason is factoring into this, and that Tim Kaine's own position on the death penalty is not simply his unthinking adherence to Catholic dogma, right? And it actually interacts with the real world and kind of like I said, the facts on the ground and different reasons to be against it in all kinds of interesting ways. And therefore, I maybe he was right. Maybe, again, there's all kinds of particularities in this case where as governor, you are kind of given a certain power that's not, like maybe you shouldn't just unilaterally say, I'm not going to enforce this or that. But what I would want to say is, okay, Tim Kaine, if you were a legislator in the Virginia legislature, would you vote for an anti-death penalty measure? Right? Because that takes away the kind of weirdness of being governor and having this like decision solely thrust on your shoulders. But like, would he feel the same way if he was voting for a piece of legislation that restricted or abolished the death penalty? Would he still be like, I can't vote for that because I'm a Catholic,
right,
or because my opposition is grounded in the Catholic faith?
Well, what's wild about this though is that like this is the very reason that evangelical Christians like actually vote for Republicans, is because they will do these things. It's like Tim Kaine isn't willing to do the moral thing, but like evangelical Christians will vote for Mike Pence or whatever for, I don't know, doing something horrible and stupid that's justified by faith or whatever. So it's just this weird thing where, like, I don't know, Republicans are ready to get down with a quote unquote religious morality, but Democrats can't hang at all.
Yeah, and here's the other thing, like lots of people on the left oppose the death penalty for non-religious reasons, and I'm sort of like, in a way, who cares what your reasons are?
Yeah,
I mean that's a bit flippant, but like if when I say one thing I like about the left is they actually think politically. This is what I mean. Like, okay, like I am against the death penalty in part because that's what my faith, demands of me, or it nudges me in that direction or pushes me in that direction. But lots of other people oppose the death penalty for different reasons, and I don't know why having different reasons behind agreeing on the substance of an issue should, I just don't know why religious people should back away from that, because obviously there are many reasons to oppose the death penalty.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about coalition building, because that's always a difficult thing for people on the left. The perennial challenge, I guess, around the world is that the right is extremely unified, that, private property is very good and capitalism is the thing that should win all the time, and the left is not very unified on what it wants to do about those problems. So you make some appeals throughout this essay that make common sense, right? We gotta think really hard about how left liberal coalitions could operate, despite the fact that they're, uncomfortable bedfellows, I guess. And you make one specific comment about, you say on 112 to 113, right after what we were just kind of talking about, actually, you say the secular and religious left should work together on the other issues they do agree on. It's in the nature of political coalitions, after all, to live with a certain amount of disagreements. And that's like a good thing, I think. But this is where I guess I find a little bit of trouble cozying up to talks of coalition building with liberals in particular, because it's not based on like a shared end, in a sense. Like, there are short-term gains that make sense and that leftists can get on board with that liberals are making. But the long-term end, right? Like, if you're a good orthodox leftist, whether you're a Marxist or an anarchist or a syndicalist or whatever, a socialist of any stripe, is like the abolition of private property, I think. Which, like, the long-term shared goal of all liberals is like the absolute, retention and defense of private property. So it's just like tough. It's not like, obviously, any leftist who says, well, we should just never ever talk to the majority of people in the United States, like, that project is dead in the water. But at the same time, like, I don't know, it's hard to have those coalitions without acknowledging those, like, real disagreements, because every time the left brings one of them up, the liberals are like, see, this is why we didn't want to work with them, and they just get screwed.
Yeah, no, I don't really disagree with you on that. And I think at the very end of my piece, I use some formulation where I say, how do I put it? Religious people, social democrats, the populist left, and compassionate liberals can find agreement on X, Y, or Z. And so if my essay reads as me not making any demands on liberals to kind of move a certain direction as well, then that's not how I would ask it to be read. And I would hope that, like, the kinds of liberals who, again, here we come back to the problem of terms and definitions and how precise we're being. But people in the United States who would call themselves liberals, there's better and worse versions of that. and if someone's willing to, like, back single payer healthcare and things like, I don't know, universal basic income, or, there's all kinds of different things that you could imagine a certain kind of populist liberal or a kind of big-hearted, compassionate liberal signing on to. And that's the kind of coalition I guess I would mean. But that would entail them moving toward the left. But I guess deep down, I kind of think the left is winning a lot of these arguments, at least in terms of, look at how support for single-payer healthcare has skyrocketed in just the last year or so, right? Like, it's never been as popular as it is right now in the United States. And I think that's in part because that's, like, what happens when you engage in real politics and you make moral arguments. Like, more people, and this is a function of the Sanders campaign, I think, actually. Like, he really stuck his neck out and campaigned hard on that. And it caught on, and more people are talking about it now. And so when I appeal to liberals in the way I did in the piece, I'm kind of banking on that kind of thing happening more and more, where the arguments are actually being made, and politics is really happening, and DSA is organizing, and people are rallying around healthcare, and having that be a major issue. And I think so people can change their minds, and that's partly what I have in my mind when I mentioned liberals in the way Dean pointed out, was that kind of change or shift is possible. And it's more possible and more likely if you do what I say in the essay and actually make moral arguments that appeal to ordinary people's sense of right and wrong.
So I totally get that point, and I think it's good. I think you're right, largely. I guess I have like some weird experiences though where it hasn't played out quite so neatly, and I guess it never will. Not that I'm accusing you of like saying it would play out neatly, because like that's not politics at all. But like I don't know. So in St. Louis, there's like a debtor's prison basically, and it became like really popular in the news a hot second ago because it's just like hot as crap out here, and there's no air conditioning. Anyways, so there's this like this thing organized like to like a vigil or something, you know, to kind of bring attention and awareness to this issue, and it was a pretty clear demarcation about who was left and who was liberal in that conversation, though, because it's like people on the left were like, yeah, and like this is a prison that shouldn't even exist in the first place, and then like liberals were like, well, it should have air conditioning. So it's like we can like agree on certain topics for a point though, but like at some point those coalitions like fall apart because I don't know, liberals aren't leftists. I don't know. Yeah. It's messy and it's hard. I guess like you just choose your battles and win them when you can. And then let go, I guess, when you can't.
Yeah, I don't want to belabor the point either, but I guess I would just want to add, this is the problem with Bernie Sanders. I mean, I've been trying to be very friendly to him lately, more friendly than I've been in the past, because I don't want to be like that mean leftist on the internet. But, you know, like Bernie Sanders also doesn't really want to end private property. Like, he wants to break up the big banks. Sorry, if you're a leftist, you want bigger banks, and then you want to turn them into like state institutions. Like, nationalize the banks. Don't like break them up into, you know, better, well-functioning, like humble capitalist banks. And, you know, those are, like, real problems. And one thing that really jumped out to me when I was reading your essay is actually precisely the moral point with respect to things like private property. There's an early essay by Friedrich Engels. This is, like, a very pedantic point, and I'm sorry to make it, but, like, I just have to. So he has this really early essay, Engels does, Outlines of a Critique of Political Economy. And I remember this essay is like one of the things that turned me into a leftist when I was a Christian at an evangelical school. And he makes this interesting comment that I went back to and read. I'll just like read part of it really quick. So he says, the perpetual fluctuation of prices, such as is created by the condition of competition, completely deprives trade of its last vestige of morality, right? So he's talking about how, like, hey, if you got to compete with other people, you're inevitably going to compromise your morals to do that. And then he goes on to say, where does there remain any possibility of exchange based on a moral foundation in this whirlpool of capitalism? In the continuous up and down, everyone must seek to hit upon the most favorable moment for purchase and sale. Everyone must become a spectator or speculator, that is to say, must reap what he has not sown, must enrich himself at the expense of others, calculate on the misfortune of others, or let chance win for him, etc. Right? Not mind-blowing points, but as he goes on to say in the essay, that all relates to private property, and almost reducibly. Like he says throughout this whole thing that, like, once we get rid of private property, not going to have to deal with that problem. Like, immorality will still be there, but not because of competition, which forces you into that. So, yeah, I guess that's just a long way of saying moral austerity, that's, like, it can only be solved by the abolition of a system premised on competition. I guess that's like my leftist point that stops me from being friends with Bernie Sanders.
No, that's a fair point, I guess. And, you know, one of the unsatisfactory things about my essay is that in 3,000 words, I kind of move between, I don't know, political philosophy in some senses, right? Talking about the separation of powers and, you know, the kind of liberalism as a philosophy or political philosophy, and then day-to-day contemporary politics, right? I move between those two things in ways that, you know, aren't satisfactory. So you're not necessarily wrong, but, you know, and in fact, before I started writing this, when Michael Kazin of Dissent first reached out to me, he was like, so, like, how can we maybe win some of these religious people who keep voting for Republicans? You know, and that's not what the essay is about, but it was kind of generated by a certain practical concern. So on the other hand, I would say, like, if moving forward and improving the lives of lots of people depends on the abolition of private property, we're going to be waiting a long time in this country. You know?
Yeah, sure.
So it's like, you know, you're not wrong, but it's also that's a deep and profound critique of the entire way our lives are organized right now. And it's like, where do you start in terms of unraveling that? And I don't know. I think, you know, my essay points to some things, but you're right. It doesn't give the radical root and branch critique of our entire system right now. But I would also say, too, like, there is something aspirational about the essay in that, one thing I don't do is like crunch a bunch of numbers and say, like, oh, like certain percentage of people are religious and like want this kind of healthcare system, or a certain number of people are religious and could end up voting this way or that way. It's more like, I think if you build it, they will come. Like, there are a lot of religious people in this country, and I don't think they've been even presented with ideas resembling some of the stuff we're talking about. So I kind of don't know what's possible, but I feel like if more and more people are confronted with, you know, like I said, this is a country with a lot of Christians in it, a lot of religious people, and if more and more people are just find themselves confronting arguments that they haven't really heard before about how their faith can relate to politics, maybe the needle starts to move a little bit in a good way. Does that make sense to put it that way? Like, there is something aspirational here. Like, if you build it, they will come. That's if you talk this way, it might resonate. And especially, like, there has to be people out there who have voted their entire life for the Republican Party and they have to be thinking, like, what the hell has happened? What's really going on? Like, and people have to be asking themselves that right now. Maybe Trump's diehard supporters aren't, but I think this is a moment that's fluid and uncertain, and we should be bold in making these arguments because you don't really know what the effects will be. But they could be more than you think. And I think there are possibilities that are open now that maybe for the last 20 or 30 years weren't really open.
Well, going off of what you just said, I guess, about, there have to be people who are religious who are like wondering like what is going on with the Republican Party and like what's going on morally, I guess, in politics in the United States. It leads me to, I guess, a question that maybe you can help answer. In your essay, you actually like reference a lot of pretty good Christian leftists, like Reverend Barber and Robert McElroy and a few others, I think, that are in there, but I can't remember off the top of my head. Anyways, so they're actually like, there was a time when there was a religious left, a Christian left, I guess, to be specific with the people we're talking about here. So I wonder like what you would say about like where they went and like what you think the a possible future is for the Christian left.
Oh, wow. The history is like, I'm not a historian, and I think what you basically said was right. And there was historically something of a Christian left, in different iterations through the decades, right? I mean, social gospel stuff, various critics of capitalism, civil rights movement, anti-nuclear movement. There have been these, sort of flashpoints that have highlighted the existence of a Christian left. I don't really know what the possibilities are for it. I mean, like I said, I went out of my way to avoid some of those questions, like counting numbers and sort of saying, oh, like this exists, therefore X, Y, or Z is possible. So I'm very heartened by someone like Reverend Barber, who's obviously an amazing man doing great work. And I'm really heartened by people like Bishop McElroy in San Diego, who really, I mean, that speech he gave in Modesto that I give a brief excerpt from at the end of the essay, I mean, that's really worth reading in full. I mean, that was about as strong a statement against Trump and Trumpism as I've heard from like anyone, really, since he was elected and then inaugurated. So I do think there are, maybe I'm trying to have it both ways. I do think there's possibilities you can point to, like a Reverend Barber, like a Bishop McElroy. But I wouldn't want my argument to be contingent on them, because, like I said, what I try to give was a framework for one way this might play out, one way we might think and argue about it. And I don't know if it exists, but I think it should, and I think it's possible that what I described, uh, comes into being in a way that it's not right now. And so, like I said before, there is something aspirational about this. Because I had read a bunch of pieces that kind of did count heads and tried to say, oh, like liberal people don't go to church as often, or you those kinds of demographic statistics. And there is one thing I should say. The point about what people deserve, the question of desert, I mean, that I don't really say this in the essay, but that really does come out of conversations I've had with my lefty friends who aren't religious at all. And it's the left who, the people in red states who voted for Trump who now might have their health care destroyed or taken away. Yeah. Like, it's the people on the left saying, actually, it's really horrifying to say, like, oh, that's what those people deserve. They voted for him. Now let them get their comeuppance. Yeah. It's those kinds of conversations where it's always been my friends, even comrades, shall I say, on the left who say that again and again. And I found, points of agreement with them in conversations over beers, right, talking about these things. And that was the point that really came out the most, was just that shared sense of what people deserve. That was the point of contact between myself and my friends who aren't religious, but do identify as being on the left.
Yeah, it's even it's always kind of like a moment with some friction in it too, when someone will ask, I don't know, what does Trump deserve, or what does Pence deserve? And it's like, well, they deserve the same thing that everyone does, I guess, like universal health care and access to education. That'd be great. I don't know. It's just I guess that is kind of a moralistic moment though, where leftists have to be kind of hard-lined about that. Like if the left deserves it, the right does too. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it doesn't sit well with people on the left.
Yeah, it does not sit well with me. I just think Trump ruthlessly deserves mocking and a tragic rest of his life. But that's a moral problem that I recognize. So.
Well, I mean, you can mock him relentlessly, but still make sure he can go to the doctor or something.
Yeah, I guess.
He'll need to get some. He'll need to get some burn cream from all those sick burns he got.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. All right.
Well, Matt Sitman, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a really good conversation. I think it's been nice the last few episodes we've just been talking about, the left and Christianity in general. So we did one on the left and then one on Christians. So this is a good conversation where we were able to bring some of that together, I think. And I don't know, hopefully it's helpful, especially for people on both sides of that issue, just trying to find ways to, build the kind of actual movement that we still desperately need and hasn't fully materialized.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. It was fun to talk about it. And things are really bad out there. I take a pretty dire view of the Trump presidency and what he's doing to the country and our institutions, and just the prospects for anything resembling meaningful self-government. So I'm kind of let's just make these arguments and hope they stick. And why hold back, or why be afraid? I know my essay will upset some people, and talking about religion and politics, the two things you're not supposed to talk about in polite company. Right?
We'll see you on the pages of Commonweal. Hopefully, converting the Catholics to the left in the meantime.
Yeah, that's phase 2 of the project. Is
Hey, thanks for listening to this episode of the Magnificast. Thanks again, Matt Sitman, for sitting in with us. This is really fun. If you want to get involved more with us, you can follow us on all the things. We're on Twitter. We've got a blog. We have a letter now, newsletter, so don't forget about that. We've got email. We've got Facebook. We've got it all the things you could do. We're training pigeons as we speak. They're not very good yet, so who knows how that's going to go. But yeah, Magnificast in your real-life mailbox, delivered by real-life pigeons, coming soon. I don't know. Any real final thoughts here, Matt?
Nope.
Okay, good. As always, we're gonna go ahead and let the illogical spoon play us out here, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.